Today on Playbook of Empires, we're examining the most dangerous and predictable pattern in all of human history. A pattern that methodically destroyed the greatest, most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever seen. And a pattern that, if history is any guide, might be unfolding right now in real time, before our very eyes in the world's current dominant superpower. Introduction. The pattern. Nobody wants to see in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire vanished. For over 1,000 years it had seemed invincible, commanding the known world and representing absolute power. Yet one day, its citizens awoke to find their currency worthless, their borders dissolved, and their civilization gone. The most haunting part? The Romans never saw it coming. Each generation believed their empire was eternal, that corruption, debt, inequality, and moral decay were temporary crises that would somehow resolve themselves. They were wrong. Today, historians and economists see unsettling parallels. The same mechanisms that destroyed Rome appear to be emerging within the modern superpower, the United States. This isn't about fear-mongering or prediction. It's an analysis of recurring historical patterns that have shaped and ended great civilizations throughout time. This study invites readers to confront those patterns head-on. The erosion of institutional trust, rising inflation, crushing national debt, and deep social division. The goal is not to declare an imminent collapse, but to provide a historical lens through which to interpret our present moment. Across 5 chapters, this analysis explores the forces that dismantled Rome and asks whether similar dynamics are now at work in America. Understanding these parallels doesn't just reveal history's echoes. It offers a framework for recognizing the signs of decline before it's too late. Because civilizations don't fall overnight. They decay slowly, invisibly, until one day everyone wakes up to realize that what once felt permanent has already disappeared. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Permanence. In 400 AD, Rome seemed unbreakable. For centuries, it had ruled the Mediterranean, built roads and aqueducts that still exist, and conquered vast territories from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman citizenship was the most coveted privilege of the ancient world. More than anything, Romans believed their empire would last forever. This wasn't arrogance, it was logic. They had survived civil wars, invasions, and plagues for centuries. To them, Rome's permanence felt proven, but empire collapse doesn't happen overnight. It becomes inevitable long before it becomes visible. Like an avalanche, the failure builds slowly beneath the surface until one small shift brings everything down. What seems sudden to outsiders is, in truth, the natural consequence of ignored decay. Rome's decline followed that script. Long before its fall, the foundations had weakened. The government diluted its currency, destabilizing the economy. Military campaigns stretched resources thin. Corruption and political paralysis crippled leadership. Yet each generation believed Rome would endure because it always had. Fast forward to 2025. After World War II, the United States emerged as the global superpower. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, and American military power shaped international order. For 80 years, this dominance has felt inevitable. Most Americans view it as permanent, an unshakable truth. American exceptionalism perfectly captures this mindset. The belief that history's rules apply to others, never to them, but beneath the surface, cracks are visible. In 2024, U.S. national debt reached $34.8 trillion, 122% of GDP. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 73% in 2001 to 58% in 2024. Nations like China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia are now trading outside the dollar system. These aren't isolated facts. They're early signals of structural fatigue. This isn't a prediction of collapse. It's a recognition of pattern. Every empire believed its dominance was unique and eternal, right up until the moment it wasn't. The illusion of permanence isn't proof of strength. It's often the first symptom of decline. Rome had evidence for its endurance. So does America. But history asks a harder question. Do the mechanisms that sustain that power still function? Because once a civilization stops questioning its own permanence, it stops protecting it. And that, more than any enemy, is what brings empires down. Chapter 2. Currency Debasement, the Silent Killer. Empires rarely destroy their money overnight. It dies slowly, eroded by subtle debasement so gradual that no one notices until trust is gone. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero's denarius contained 95% silver. It was the backbone of Roman commerce, accepted from Britain to Egypt. Holding a denarius meant holding value. But as Rome's ambitions grew, its expenses exceeded its income. Military campaigns, public works, free grain for citizens, and extravagant games drained the treasury. The Imperial solution was simple: reduce the silver content in coins while keeping the same face value. Nero lowered purity to 93%. Trajan dropped it to 89%. By Marcus Aurelius's reign, it was 79%. Septimius Severus cut it to 50%, and under Gallienus in 265 AD, the coin contained only 5% silver. Historian Peter Tamine estimated that prices rose over 1,000% between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Merchants refused payment in denarii. Soldiers demanded gold or goods instead. Commerce reverted to barter, and trade networks collapsed. Rome didn't just face inflation, it lost monetary trust, the invisible glue of its economy. Now consider the US dollar. Until 1971, it was tied to gold through the Bretton Woods system, where foreign governments could exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. This constraint prevented excessive printing. But on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard, transforming the dollar into a fiat currency, backed only by government decree and public faith. Since then, the dollar's value has steadily eroded. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, $1 in 1971 equals about $7.60 in 2024, an 87% loss in purchasing power. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve's M2 money supply grew from $600 billion in 1971 to roughly $21 trillion in 2024, that's almost 400% increase. During 2020 alone, amid pandemic stimulus, the Fed created 25% of all existing dollars in a single year. Rome took 2 centuries to debase its currency from 95% to 5% to silver. The US has reduced its dollar's real value by nearly 90% in just over 50 years. The tools are different, printing presses instead of mints, but the pattern is strikingly familiar. This isn't a doomsday forecast. It's a historical observation. When empires spend more than they earn, they eventually dilute their currency. Rome did it. The Weimar Republic did it. The Spanish Empire flooded markets with silver from the New World. Zimbabwe and Venezuela did it in modern times. Once begun, the process accelerates, and reversing it becomes nearly impossible. The International Monetary Fund has tracked 775 fiat currencies throughout history. None survive unchanged. 20% collapsed through hyperinflation. Others vanished in wars, reforms, or revolutions. The average fiat currency lasts just 27 years. The dollar, as a pure fiat system, has endured for 53 years. Does that mean it's doomed? Not necessarily, but it does mean history whispers a warning. Every empire believed it was different until it wasn't. Romans didn't wake up to a sudden collapse. They lived through decades of slow erosion until money simply stopped working. The fall of trust, not metal or paper, ends a currency. And once that trust slips away, no decree, promise, or printing press can bring it back. Chapter 3. Imperial Overreach, the cost of global dominance. At its zenith around 117 AD under Emperor Trajan, Rome controlled approximately 5 million square kilometers. The empire stretched from Scotland to Sudan, from Portugal to Persia. Roman legions garrisoned hundreds of fortifications across 3 continents. This expansion created an illusion of strength. More territory meant more resources, more tribute, more power. Roman citizens took pride in maps, showing their empire's vast reach. But here's what those maps didn't show. The cost of maintaining that empire was bleeding Rome dry. According to economic historians' estimates, military spending consumed between 50 to 75% of the Roman budget by the 3rd century AD. Every conquered territory required garrisoning. Every garrison required supply lines. Every supply line needed protection. The costs compounded exponentially. Rome faced a strategic trap. Withdrawing from territories meant admitting weakness and encouraging rebellions. Maintaining positions meant diverting resources from the empire's core. There was no good option. The empire tried to solve this through increased taxation. Provincial tax rates increased dramatically during the 3rd and 4th centuries. But higher taxes reduced economic productivity, which reduced tax revenue, which necessitated even higher tax rates. This death spiral eventually made the empire economically unsustainable. By the 5th century, Rome couldn't afford to defend its borders adequately. Not because Romans lacked military skill or courage, but because the empire had overextended to a point where the economics no longer worked. When Germanic tribes crossed the frontier, Rome lacked the resources to mount an effective response. Now, let's examine American military expenditure. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, U.S. military spending in 2024 reached approximately $877 billion. This exceeds the combined military budgets of the next 10 countries: China, 292B, Russia, 86B, India, 84B, Saudi Arabia, 76B, United Kingdom, 74B, Germany, 66B, France with 61B, South Korea, 48B, Japan, 46B, and Ukraine, 44B. The United States maintains approximately 750 military installations across 80 countries. According to Department of Defense base structure reports, American troops are currently stationed in Syria, Iraq, multiple African nations, throughout Europe, across Asia, and in numerous other global locations. The costs extend far beyond the official defense budget. According to the Cost of War project at Brown University, post-9/11 wars have cost the United States approximately $8 trillion when including veterans care, interest on borrowed money, and Department of Homeland Security spending. These conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere have lasted over 2 decades with ambiguous results. Here's the parallel. Like Rome, America maintains a global military presence that requires enormous ongoing expenditure. And like Rome, this presence was established when America's economic dominance was unquestioned. But circumstances change. In 1960, the United States accounted for approximately 40% of global GDP. By 2024, according to World Bank data, that figure had declined to roughly 25%. Meanwhile, China's share of global GDP has increased from less than 2% in 1980 to approximately 18% in 2024. America's military commitments were established when it generated 40% of global economic output. Those commitments remain largely unchanged while American economic dominance has declined significantly. The mathematics of this situation deserve consideration. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 provides an instructive parallel. Soviet military spending reached approximately 15-20% of GDP during the 1980s, according to various estimates. This level proved unsustainable. The USSR had nuclear weapons, a massive military, and controlled territory from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. None of that prevented economic collapse when the underlying system became unstable. Paul Kennedy's 1987 book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, identified this pattern across multiple empires. Spain, France, Britain, and others followed similar trajectories. Initial success leads to territorial expansion. Expansion requires military commitments. Commitments drain resources. Resource drain weakens the core economy. Weakened economy can't sustain the military and the empire contracts. I'm not predicting American military collapse. I'm observing that the pattern of imperial overreach follows identifiable economic logic. Maintaining global military dominance requires enormous sustained expenditure. That expenditure must be funded either through taxation, borrowing, or currency creation. Each funding method creates its own problems. According to the Congressional Budget Office, net interest payments on U.S. debt reached $892 billion in fiscal year 2024. The government now spends more on interest payments than on defense. As debt increases and interest rates remain elevated, this situation compounds. Rome couldn't sustain its military commitments once the economic foundation weakened. Britain couldn't maintain its empire after World War II depleted its resources. The Soviet Union couldn't continue the Cold War when military spending consumed too much economic output. Could America face similar constraints? That's not a prediction of doom. It's a question about whether economic fundamentals ultimately constrain even superpowers. History suggests they do, but history doesn't dictate the future. The pattern exists. Whether the pattern applies remains an open question. Chapter 4. Bread and Circuses. The Politics of Distraction. 140 AD, the Roman poet Juvenal wrote a phrase that would echo through history. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. He was describing how the Roman population had traded political engagement for entertainment and state subsidies. This wasn't metaphor, it was literal government policy. Rome provided free grain, distributions called the annona, to hundreds of thousands of citizens in Rome. According to historical estimates, approximately 200,000 to 320,000, Roman citizens received these subsidies by the 3rd century AD. The program consumed a significant portion of government revenue and required a massive bureaucracy to administer. Simultaneously, Rome invested enormous resources in public entertainment. The Colosseum hosted elaborate spectacles, gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, executions, and even mock naval battles where the arena was flooded with water. Chariot races at the circus. Maximus attracted crowds exceeding 150,000 spectators. Why did Rome do this? The answer is politically brilliant and historically common. A population that's fed and entertained doesn't organize politically. They don't demand governmental accountability. They don't question the empire's direction. The Roman elite understood that maintaining social stability required keeping the masses content. As long as citizens had their basic needs met and their attention occupied, they remained politically passive. This allowed the elite to pursue policies that benefited themselves without significant popular opposition. The historian Tacitus noted this dynamic when he wrote about how Romans had lost their taste for political liberty. They have become indifferent to freedom, requiring only bread and circuses. Fast forward to contemporary America. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics American Time Use Survey, Americans spend an average of approximately 3 hours daily watching television. Add time on smartphones, social media, streaming services, and gaming, and many Americans consume 7+ hours of media content daily. This isn't judgment. It's observation about attention allocation. 7 hours daily represents nearly half of waking hours. Time spent consuming entertainment is time not spent engaging with complex policy issues, organizing politically, or scrutinizing government actions. The entertainment itself has become extraordinarily sophisticated. Social media platforms use algorithms designed by teams of engineers and psychologists to maximize engagement. These systems exploit human psychological vulnerabilities, the dopamine hits from likes, the outrage triggers that drive sharing, the endless scroll that prevents natural stopping points. According to internal documents released in 2021, Facebook's own research found that its algorithms promoted divisive and inflammatory content because such content generated higher engagement. The platform's recommendation systems weren't designed to inform users or facilitate political organization. They were designed to maximize time spent on the platform. Now consider government economic policy during crises. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the US government distributed approximately $814 billion in direct stimulus payments to Americans in 3 rounds, 2020-2021. These weren't loans. They were direct cash transfers. Were these payments economically necessary? That's debatable among economists. Were they politically effective at maintaining social stability during a potential crisis? Absolutely. The payments arrived with minimal political opposition, kept consumption from collapsing, and prevented the kind of social unrest that might have emerged from extended economic hardship. I'm not arguing against the payments themselves. I'm pointing out the functional similarity to Rome's grain distributions. When economic stress increases, governments provide subsidies to maintain stability. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Consider also the nature of modern political discourse. According to a Pew Research Center study, Americans increasingly get news from social media rather than traditional journalistic sources. These platforms prioritize emotionally engaging content over nuanced analysis. Political coverage focuses on personality conflicts, scandals, and tribal identity rather than substantive policy analysis. The result? Americans are more politically engaged in the superficial sense, more outraged, more tribal, more emotionally invested in political teams, but they're simultaneously less engaged with the actual mechanics of governance. Most Americans couldn't explain how monetary policy works, how the federal budget gets allocated, or what specific policies their representatives support beyond broad cultural signaling. This represents a sophisticated evolution of bread and circuses. Rome kept people distracted with physical spectacles. Modern America keeps people distracted with digital spectacles. Rome provided grain. Modern America provides stimulus payments and complex welfare systems. The mechanisms differ. The function remains similar. Here's why this matters. Politically passive populations don't prevent imperial decline. They enable it. When citizens don't scrutinize government spending, currency debasement continues unchecked. When military overextension goes unquestioned, resources drain away. When political theater replaces substantive debate, fundamental problems remain unaddressed. Rome's citizens weren't stupid. They were rationally responding to incentives. Why engage in difficult political work when the government provides basic needs and abundant entertainment? The same logic applies today. I'm not predicting that Americans will suddenly become politically engaged or that they won't. I'm observing that the pattern of using subsidies and entertainment to maintain political passivity appears in declining empires repeatedly. Rome did it. So did the Ottomans in their late period. So did the Soviets with their propaganda and state-controlled entertainment. The pattern suggests that when empires face systemic challenges, they often respond by pacifying their populations rather than addressing root causes. This approach works temporarily. It delays instability, but it doesn't solve the underlying problems, and may actually prevent the political will necessary to implement difficult reforms. Whether America is following this pattern or represents a unique case remains an open question, but the mechanisms are worth understanding. Chapter 5. The Collapse Timeline. When systems fail, here's what most people misunderstand about imperial collapse. It doesn't happen suddenly. It happens gradually, then all at once. Rome didn't fall on a specific day. The Western Roman Empire experienced a prolonged process of decline, spanning centuries. But within that gradual decline came tipping points, where the rate of deterioration accelerated dramatically. Consider the timeline. 80 AD, the death of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, marking the end of Rome's peak stability. 284 AD, the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome experienced 50 emperors in 50 years, most dying violently. The currency collapsed, the borders contracted, the empire nearly fragmented entirely. 2 AD, Diocletian temporarily stabilized the empire through authoritarian reforms, including price controls, tax restructuring, and division of the empire into administrative units. 337 AD, Constantine reunified the empire and moved the capital to Constantinople. effectively acknowledging Rome's declining importance. AD, the Visigoths, fleeing Hun invasions, were allowed to settle within Roman borders. Mistreatment by Roman officials led to the Battle of Adrianople, 378 AD, where Goths defeated Roman legions and killed Emperor Valens. Petu AD, Visigoth king Alaric sacked. Rome itself, the first time in 800 years the city had fallen to foreign forces. AD. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This date is conventionally used to mark the empire's fall. Notice the pattern? From Marcus Aurelius' death to the empire's end took 300 years, but within that time frame came accelerating crises. The 3rd century crisis nearly destroyed the empire in just 50 years. The final collapse from Adrianople to the empire's end took less than a century. This is how system failure works. Degradation accumulates gradually. The system absorbs shocks and continues functioning, appearing resilient. Then a threshold is crossed. The accumulated damage reaches a point where the system can no longer recover. Collapse accelerates rapidly. Now let's consider America's timeline, not as prediction, but as pattern observation. 1944. Bretton Woods Agreement establishes dollar as global reserve currency. American dominance begins. 21. Nixon ends gold convertibility. Monetary expansion becomes unlimited by commodity constraints. 1991. Soviet Union collapses. America becomes sole superpower. Defense spending and global commitments increase. 2001. 9/11 attacks trigger 2-decade wars costing trillions. Debt begins accelerating. 2008. Financial crisis requires massive intervention. Federal Reserve begins. Unprecedented monetary expansion through quantitative easing. 2020. COVID. Pandemic triggers the largest monetary expansion in U.S. history. Debt reaches unprecedented peacetime levels. 2023-2025 rising. Interest rates make debt servicing increasingly expensive. International de-dollarization efforts accelerate. From 1971 to 2025 represents 54 years. If we're following Rome's pattern, we're potentially still in the early to middle stages of decline. Rome remained powerful for centuries after currency debasement began, but here's the critical difference. Everything moves faster now. Information, capital, trade, and social movements all operate at speeds incomprehensible to ancient civilizations. Rome took centuries to decline because changes propagated slowly across vast distances. Modern America operates in an interconnected global system where capital flows electronically, where information spreads instantly, where financial contagion can cascade through markets in hours rather than months. This means if America is experiencing imperial decline, the timeline could compress dramatically compared to historical precedents. What took Rome 300 years might take modern America decades. I'm not predicting this will happen. I'm observing that technological acceleration affects all processes, including potentially systemic collapse. Consider how quickly other modern collapses occurred. The Soviet Union appeared stable in 1985. By 1991, it no longer existed. 6 years. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the globe in 1945. By 1965, most colonies had gained independence. 20 years. Argentina was one of the world's 10 richest countries in 1913. By 2001, it experienced complete economic collapse. Less than a century. Venezuela had South America's highest per capita income in 1950s. By 2018, hyperinflation and economic collapse created mass immigration. 6 decades. Modern systems can fail surprisingly quickly once critical thresholds are crossed. The question isn't whether America matches Rome exactly. The question is whether similar underlying dynamics create similar vulnerabilities. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, has studied the rise and fall of reserve currency empires extensively. His research identifies common patterns. Rising power accumulates wealth and dominance, establishes reserve currency status, uses that status to run deficits, accumulates unsustainable debts, faces challenges from rising powers, experiences military conflicts, and eventually loses reserve currency status as trust erodes. According to Dalio's analysis, this cycle has played out repeatedly. The Dutch guilder, 1600s are in 1700s, the British pound, 1800s, 1900s, and now potentially the US dollar. Each cycle takes roughly 150 years from rise to decline. The dollar achieved reserve status in 1944. We're now 80 years into that cycle. Does this mean collapse is imminent? No. Historical patterns don't guarantee specific outcomes. But they do suggest that believing in permanent American dominance requires believing America is fundamentally different from every empire that came before it. That's possible. But it's also what every declining empire's citizens believed about themselves. Conclusion: the uncomfortable truth. This analysis hasn't tried to predict the future. It has simply traced recurring patterns that have marked the decline of great empires: currency debasement, military overreach, and political distraction through entertainment and subsidies. These forces destroyed Rome and have reappeared in nearly every civilization that followed. The question is whether these same dynamics are emerging in modern America. The evidence is troubling. National debt now exceeds $34 trillion. The dollar has lost 87% of its purchasing power since 1971. The United States maintains global military commitments even as its share of world economic output declines. Political debate fixates on cultural division rather than fiscal or structural reform. Does this guarantee collapse? No. America has technological and institutional strengths that Rome never possessed. Its economy remains the largest in the world, and its military unmatched. Yet Rome, too, had extraordinary advantages: engineering, law, and organization that outlasted the empire itself. None were enough to save a system that became economically unsustainable. 3 lessons stand out. First, question permanence. No empire is immune to decline, and believing otherwise blinds societies to risk. Second, understand the mechanisms. Monetary erosion, excessive commitments, and social pacification are measurable, observable processes. Watch them closely. Third, focus on individual preparation. Regardless of national outcomes, awareness allows people to act prudently, protecting their savings, diversifying assets, and cultivating resilience. Romans, who recognized the denarius's collapse, preserved their wealth. Those who trusted the system lost everything. The message is not to panic, but to pay attention. History doesn't repeat precisely, but it rhymes. The symbols have changed. Dollars instead of denarii, aircraft carriers instead of legions, social media instead of the Colosseum, but the dynamics of decline remain recognizable. If you see the patterns, you have an advantage most citizens of collapsing empires never had: access to information and historical hindsight. What you choose to do with that knowledge determines your future. Stay informed, stay critical, and above all, stay prepared. Because every empire falls, but those who understand how it happens stand the best chance of enduring what comes after.